Hello, welcome again to our video lesson, and this video lesson will cover a topic about permutation, specifically permutation of objects in a line and specifically about distinct objects. So let's start already. Alright, so let's define first what is permutation. And this definition is actually taken from the Mathematics 10 module of DepEd. And according to the definition of the module, a permutation refers to the different arrangement of objects in a definitive manner in which the order of the objects is important. So in here, what is very important here that has to be taken note by you learners is that in permutation, the arrangement and the order is very important. Okay, because later on we'll be talking about combination, and this is the thing that actually separates one from the other. Meaning, mabawaan nimo nga permutation na siya and mabawaan nimo nga combination na siya because permutation, specifically as what the definition has mentioned, ang iyaha gyud ani is importante ang order sa pag-arrange nimo sa mga objects. So permutation is actually divided into two main groups, and this is how our discussion about permutation will also be going. Okay, so under permutation, there are permutations that the object is being arranged in a line, and we also have permutation of objects in a circle. Now, under permutation in a line, we also have two topics under there. This is permutation in distinct objects and then permutation of non-distinct objects. So basically, our main focus for this video lesson is to talk about permutation of distinct objects. Right, so let's now proceed to our example. Okay, so before we go further, since we are focused on permutation of distinct objects for this video lesson, it's very important that we define first what is a permutation of distinct objects, because we will also be talking about permutation of non-distinct objects on our next video lesson. And it's very important that you determine the difference between these two kinds of permutation in a line. Now, the definition that I will be using is again taken from the Mathematics 10 module of DepEd, and according to the definition, a permutation of distinct objects refers to the different arrangement of distinct objects in a line. Actually, this is similar to how our permutation is being defined. But aside from that, there is an additional definition that would actually give us an idea what do we mean when we say permutation of distinct objects. Now, when we say different arrangements, okay, it means to say that no objects are identical or the same. So, pag mag-arrange daw ta sa mga objects, kinahanglan ang isa ka object wala siya kapariha dito sa imuhang gipang arrange. That will fall under distinct objects, permutation of distinct objects. Now, let's have examples for this one so that we could better understand the concept. So I prepared here actually two examples, and the first example is this one, arranging three different potted plants in a row. Okay, so how do we arrange, or in how many ways can we arrange these three different potted plants in a row? That's the first thing that we will be doing. The second is choosing a president, a vice president, and a secretary from three students. So in how many ways can we assign? No, there are three students that we will be assigning as a president, as a vice president, and a secretary. So in how many ways can we assign these three positions to these three students? So that's the second example. So to go further with our lesson here, let's now go to the solution of the first example. Okay, so we have now our first example, arranging three different potted plants in a row. So basically in here, what we wanted to know is that how many possible ways can we arrange these three different potted plants in a row. So there are two ways that I would like to show the solution of this. The first one is we will have to be using an illustration and specifically a tree diagram. Again, there are a lot of ways that we can illustrate the permutation, but I will only just be focusing on how to illustrate it using a tree diagram. I have prepared some graphical representation of the three different potted plants so that it would be more clearer to you. And I assign each potted plant with letters, no symbols, letter, because I will be using the letters instead of the different graphical representation of the potted plants in the tree diagram, because it's much more practical to use symbols instead of these drawings. All right, so let's start now with our illustration. Now, in here, I'll be using a tree diagram as an illustration. And again, of course, there are so many ways that you can illustrate permutation and even fundamental counting principle. But I would just like to focus on using a tree diagram. Now, if you would be arranging three potted plants in a row, three different potted plants in a row, that would mean there would be three spots that you will have to consider because there are three plants. So you have nakay dapat tulupod ka butanganan sa mga potted plants. So we will just call that as spot, no? There would be the first spot, the second spot, and the third spot. Now, the first spot, no, sa pinakaunang spot nga ibutang nimo ang mga plants, we will call that as our first event. Okay? Ay did na man ka unahon man na nimo, okay, ang first spot unsa imong ibutang nga plant diha. Now, pagkahuman dayon, ang ikaduha na pod nga spot imo na to i-consider nga second event. And that would mean nga katong ikatulong nga spot or space, if you would like to, if it will help you understand more better, spot or space, the third spot or space, it will now be considered as our third event. Now, sa first nga space or first nga spot, of course, kay mo pa may pagbutang nimo og mga plants, meaning naa kay tulo ka potted plants. Ang tulo mismo ka potted plants ang imuhang pilian ana. Okay, it's either si potted plant A, B, or C. Tulo pa gid na siya kay mo pa may pag-arrange nimo. Now, pagkahuman nimong pili sa tulo sa pinakauna nga spot or space, of course kinapili naman na nimo. Pag-abot nimo dito sa second space or second spot, which is actually our second event, duha na lang ang possible nimo nga choices. That would mean nga kung sa first spot ang napilian nimo is ang A ang imong ibutang, that means on the second spot either si B o si C na lang ang imuhang i-consider kung kinsay ibutang. Now, kung sa first spot ang B nga potted plant ang napilian nimo nga ibutang una, that would mean on the second spot ang imuhang possible nga mga choices, again duha na lang gihapon. It could either be A or C. And then, if kung sa first spot ang napilian nimo ang potted plant nga C, in the second spot, still two choices ra gihapon. And it could either be potted plant A or potted plant B. So, in the second spot, there will only be two choices na lang. Kay makuha naman, dito sa first spot nga tulo, magkuha naman kag isa dito. So, sa second spot, there will only be two possible choices na lang yudahin. Whatever ang mapilian sa first spot, okay, kung kita man na nimo, bisag ma-A man na siya, ma-B or ma-C, sa second spot, duha ra gyudayon ang imuhang pilian. Now, sa second spot, if ang imong napili kay B, that would mean sa third spot, C na lang siya. So, isa na lang, automatic, isa na lang yun ang choices dayon sa third spot. Sa duha nga pilian nimo sa second spot, kay magkuha naman po kag isa ana nga imong ibutang, automatic, isa na lang. Ang katong nabili na lang yun ang imong ibutang sa third spot. So, kung sa second spot, magpili ka either ni B or C, no? Ibutang ta nga si A ang imuhang napili sa first spot. So, mag-choice naman lang din ka or magpili naman lang din ka kang B o C. Kung si B ang imong napili, that means sa third spot si C. Now, kung si C pod ang napili sa second spot, that would mean the third spot would be B. Okay? Now, basically, in here, we can say that if we follow the arrow, okay, if A is being chosen in the first space or first spot, and then si B ang napilian sa second spot, that would mean si C will be in the third spot. And one of the possible arrangement of that would be plot A, B, and C. There would be also nga kung si A ang sa first spot, and then instead of B on the second spot, nahimo siya nga C, that would mean on the third spot, ang imuhang potted plant nga ibutang kay si B. And that would mean another possible arrangement would be potted A, potted C, potted plant A, C, and then I have padayon si B. Now, following the pattern of this, we can have that already. Okay? So, if you can see here, if you look at the arrangement, okay? If you look at the arrangement, because ingon baya siya, no? Permutation of distinct objects, dapat daw ang mga arrangement kay walay identical or not the same. If you look at all the possible arrangement, wala siya identical. What do you mean by that? Kung naa kay A, wala nay laing A diha nga arrangement. Si B, wala pud siya ka-identical, and si C, wala pud siya ka-identical. And this follows to all of the possible arrangement. And that is why this is considered to be permutation of distinct objects. Okay? So we are able to follow what is the definition of distinct objects. No? Look at all of the arrangement there. They have no identical or they are unique from each other. Okay? Wala siya kapareha. Okay? For each of the possible arrangement. Now, the question is, how many possible, no? Basically, ang iyang gusto mabaw-an ani is how many possible ways can we arrange these three different potted plants in a row. And if we count this, we have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and 6. So there are 6 possible ways that we can actually arrange these 3 different potted plants. Now, this is a way of answering the problem by using a tree diagram. But how about if we apply the mathematical concept of the fundamental counting principle? Alright, so in here, applying now the concept of fundamental counting principle, the first event, as what we have seen in the illustration, we have 3 possible choices in the first event. Now, on the second event, as what we have seen on the illustration, we only have 2 choices available. Okay, and that is why we have this. And, of course, we know that applying the fundamental counting principle, we multiply the events that happens at the same time. Okay? So we have times second event. Now, there is a third event also, and we know according to the illustration that in the third event, we only have 1 choice left. And that is why we put here 1. Now, if we multiply that, we have 3 times 2 is 6, and of course 6 times 1 is 6, and it's also the same answer, no? With the illustration that we are making, we only have 6 ways of arranging the 3 different potted plants. Of course, we can make arrangement more than 3, okay? If you have 4 different potted plants, we have 5 different potted plants, and so on. It's possible, okay? But for the purpose of illustrating, I only just chosen 3 because it would be a little bit more crowded already if we will be making that in a table. So that's it with this example. Now let's go to our next example. Alright, so we now go to our second example. And again, in our second example, we are to choose a president, a vice president, and a secretary from 3 students. Basically, what we wanted to know here is that how many possible ways can we assign these 3 positions to these 3 students. Now, we consider this as a problem of permutation of distinct objects because each of these 3 students will have a unique position. That would mean if one student is being chosen as the president, the 2 remaining students can only either be the vice president or the secretary. Meaning, it is not possible nga duha ang mahimong president or tulo sila nga mahimong president, no? Dili mahimong identical ang ilahang position. So if we consider that as an arrangement, we will always see that there could only be one president. Any one of them can be the president, and it's only one, any one of them could be the one of the, I mean, any one of them could be the vice president, and it's only one vice president. And of course, the remaining person will automatically becomes the secretary. Okay, but we could see that more clearly if we will do the illustration of the tree diagram. So in the illustration using a tree diagram, we have this one here. And of course, we have three events to consider. The first event is the selection of the president position. And then after the selection of the president, of course, the selection of the vice president will be followed. And then lastly, the selection of the secretary. Now, on the first event, the selection of the president, of course, all of the three students will be taken into consideration. All of them are eligible candidates. Now, after the selection of whoever becomes the president of these three students, then that means on the second event, which is actually the selection of the vice president, there can only be two students that becomes a candidate there. So you can see here, if student 1 becomes the president, of course, the candidates, the possible candidates would be student 2 and student 3. If student 2 becomes the president, the possible candidates for vice president will only be student 1 and student 3. And if student 3 is the president, student 1 and student 2 becomes the eligible candidates for vice president. And of course, anybody who will win on the second event actually has an effect on who will become the secretary, which is under the third event. So if we have to follow again the arrow, we will have here the first possible assignment could be that if student 1 is the president, it could be that the vice president can be student 2, and that means the secretary can be student 3. So we have these possible assignments. Another one is that this one here, which is another possible assignment. This could still be the same, that student 1 is the president, but then this time the vice president is student 3, and that would mean that the secretary can be student 2. And so on with all these other possible outcomes. So as you can see here, all of the possible outcomes had been illustrated, and as you can see, this actually depends on who wins on the first event, second event, and the third event. But basically, as you can see here, on all of the possible assignments, sa kada possible assignment, makita nato nga wala nag-duplicate. Lahi-lahi gyud sila. And that is why we consider this as a distinct object of arrangement. Now, again, if we count all these possible assignments, there are 6 ways, okay, that we can assign the 3 positions to the 3 students. And similarly, when we apply the fundamental counting principle, the mathematical concept, we can see here that, again, on the first event, there are 3 students that we can choose to become a president. Now, after we have chosen 1 from the 3 students, we will now be selecting who will become the vice president, and there will only be 2 candidates already there, since naa naman tayo nakuha nga isa than his first event. And after we have chosen 1 from the 2 students who will become the vice president, basically the remaining 1 student will automatically becomes the secretary, which is actually under the third event. And then we multiply all the number of ways in each of the event, and that would be, of course, 6. And so therefore, there are 6 ways of assigning the position to 3 students. So that's it for this second example.